There's a video out there with more than 4 million views. It's called How the Mormon Church Made $293 billion. And it was made by Johnny Harris, a filmmaker with almost 8 million subscribers, who used to be a Latter-day Saint himself. It might be the most watched thing anyone has ever made about my church. So I finally sat down and studied it, line by line. And here's what surprised me. He gets the facts mostly right. Where he goes wrong is the framing. That gap between a true fact and the story you wrap around it is the whole reason I wanted to make this. I'm not here to dunk on Johnny Harris. I'm going to walk his claims one at a time, grant him everything he earns, and then show you where a fair look actually lands, which is somewhere a lot quieter than his. Johnny Harris grew up in the church. He served a mission in Tijuana. In his own films, he says the faith gave him his work ethic, his focus on family, even his Spanish, and that he still feels a real sadness about losing his belief. That matters. It means we're not dealing with a stranger throwing rocks from the outside. We're dealing with someone who knows the inside of this, who made 3 long documentaries about it, and who mostly tried to be fair. His series runs all the way from the story of Joseph Smith to the money. I'm going to spend most of it on the money, because that's where the biggest number and the biggest misunderstanding both live. And then I'll come back to the origin story before we're done. My promise on this channel is simple. I'll take the question seriously, I'll treat every side of it fairly, and I'll stay faithful without ever getting loud about it. So before I defend a single thing, I'm going to do what the internet almost never does. I'm going to say out loud where Johnny is right, in his own words, before I say one word back. And I want to name something on my own side first, because it's the honest thing to do. When a faithful member hears the words hedge fund attached to their church, the reflex is to bristle, to wave it off, to go after the messenger. That reflex loses people. It's the fastest way to make an ordinary question look like a hidden wound. So I'm not doing that today. If a number is startling, I'll tell you it's startling. One honest word before we dig in. This channel is young, and it's here for one reason: to tell the story of this faith the way it actually happened, and to help share the word of the restoration with people who never once got the real version. If that's something you want more of, a like and a subscribe genuinely help a small channel like this one find its feet. And I'd love to know who I'm talking to, so do me a favor and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. So let's start where he starts, with the number. Johnny's headline claim is that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is, in his words, the richest church on earth. He says its wealth grew by roughly $100 billion in a single decade, that it's sitting on more than $200 billion in cash and stocks, and that about 65% of what it spends goes right back into growing that pile, instead of into charity. Now here's the part most reaction videos race past. On the facts, he's close to right, and he's more careful than his own title. He says plainly that reinvesting a reserve is, and I'm quoting him, actually really rational. He says the church never claimed humanitarian work was its mission. He says that if he were still a believer, he'd see this wealth as a blessing, as proof the Lord wants the church to succeed. And he admits, right out loud, that he's slightly biased in all of this. That's a fair man talking, and I want to honor it before I touch a thing. So here's my correction, and it comes down to a single word: hoarding. That word is doing an enormous amount of work in his video, and the numbers alone don't earn it. A reserve is just what an institution with no state funding and no centuries-old endowment builds, so it can survive a bad decade without shutting down congregations or pulling missionaries off the field. Gordon B. Hinckley described exactly that principle in public years ago: a rainy day fund set aside against hard times. You can think a church should hold less. That's a fair opinion. But saving isn't the same act as hoarding, and that second word smuggles in a motive the first one never proves. Then there's the claim that the humanitarian spending is, quote, just not that much. Measured against the reserve, sure. But measured against almost any other charity on earth, it's enormous. And it's growing. In the church's own annual report, the one it puts out under the title Caring for Those in Need, the figure for 2024 was about $1.5 billion in humanitarian spending across 192 countries. That's up from around $900 million just 3 years earlier. And to his credit, Johnny says this himself. He notes that since the scrutiny began, the church has increased its giving significantly. He's right. I only want you to hear the actual size of the thing he's calling small. One more note on that headline number, because it's small, but it tells you something. The reported figure, the one in the actual whistleblower complaint, is about $100 billion. The $200 billion he says on camera, and the $293 billion in his title, are estimates stacked on top of estimates. The title number is one he never actually says out loud in the whole film. I'm not accusing him of anything. Titles do a job. I just want you to know that the biggest, roundest, scariest figure is the least documented one, and the most documented figure is the smaller one. There's one more piece of his wealth story worth naming, because he builds a lot on it. Johnny credits the modern fortune to one man, a business leader from Canada named Nathan Eldon Tanner, who back in the 1970s pushed the church to stop simply spending what it took in and start investing it seriously into stocks, bonds, and real estate. On the history, he's basically right. The church did professionalize its finances in that era. But watch the verb he reaches for. He says Tanner turned it into an organization that makes money instead of one that serves. A believer looks at that same decision and sees ordinary stewardship. The difference between a family that spends every paycheck the day it lands and one that finally opens a savings account. Prudence and greed can look identical on a balance sheet. What separates them is intent, and intent is the one thing a spreadsheet can't show you. And on the secrecy charge more broadly, it's worth knowing that in the countries that legally require it, like the United Kingdom and Canada, the church files public financial accounts every single year. The reserve is quiet in the United States, where the law lets it be. It isn't quiet everywhere. Now let me get to the part of his video that isn't spin at all. It's just true, and it's the fair hit. Because a channel like mine only earns your trust if I can look at the hardest fact and not flinch. So here it is. Johnny says the church used a bunch of shell companies all around the country to hide how much money it had, and that it paid a fine. He's right. This actually happened. In February of 2023, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the federal regulator that oversees investments, charged the church's investment arm, a firm called Ensign Peak Advisors, named for a hill above Salt Lake City. The charge was that instead of filing one honest disclosure of its holdings, Ensign Peak spread the portfolio across roughly a dozen shell companies, each filing its own paperwork, specifically so no outsider could add it all up and see the total. They settled. Ensign Peak paid $4 million, and the church paid $1 million. $5 million in all, and the church's own statement didn't spin it. It said, and I'm quoting the newsroom, "We affirm our commitment to comply with the law, regret mistakes made, and now consider this matter closed." When your own church says it regrets mistakes made, you don't get to pretend nothing went wrong. Something did. The concealment was real. So where do I correct him? On one precise thing, because precision is the whole game here. Johnny describes this as the church finally learning to file its taxes the right way. It wasn't about taxes. It was never about taxes. The regulator was the Securities and Exchange Commission, not the tax authority. And the violation was a disclosure failure, the forms that large investors are required to file, called Forms 13F. The regulator never alleged the money was stolen or earned illegally, or that a single dollar of tax was owed. It alleged that the church hid the size of a portfolio it was completely entitled to hold. That's a real fault. It's a failure of transparency, and transparency matters, especially for an institution that asks people to trust it. But hiding how much you have is a different sin from stealing it or owing tax on it. And if we let those blur together, we're not describing what happened anymore. And notice the small tell in how he tells it. He calls the regulator the SCC at one point, and he says the church learned to file its taxes properly. It's a slip, and I mention it gently, not to score a point, but because the whole lesson of this video is that the small words carry the story. Get the regulator wrong, call a disclosure a tax, and a careless viewer walks away believing the church cheated the government, when what actually happened is that the church hid a number it was fully allowed to have. That brings us to the whistleblower, because Johnny mentions him too, though he keeps it vague. He says one of the employees at the investment firm alleged that around $100 billion meant for some charitable purpose wasn't used that way, and that the story ended up not really going anywhere. Fair, as far as it goes. Let me fill in what he left out, because the details cut in more than one direction. The man has a name. David Nielsen, a former portfolio manager at Ensign Peak, filed a complaint with the tax authority in 2019, and it was reported first in the Washington Post and later in an interview on the program 60 Minutes. Nielsen pointed to two specific uses of the reserve that troubled him. About $1.5 billion connected to a shopping center in Salt Lake City called City Creek, and about $600 million to prop up a church-owned insurance company. Those are the concrete allegations sitting underneath the round number. And here's the honest accounting. On the mall, the church's stated position is that no tithing donations paid for it, that it was funded through the church's commercial businesses and the earnings on invested reserves, not the 10% that members give. You're allowed to find a church building a mall strange. Plenty of members did. But strange isn't the same as the accusation Johnny's framing implies, which is that sacred donations were quietly diverted. And on the biggest charge, the one that the money was, quote, meant for charity and never used that way. Notice that this is the whistleblower's reading of what the fund was for, not a finding any court or regulator ever made. The tax authority didn't revoke the church's status. Johnny, again to his credit, tells you the story went nowhere. I just want you to know why it went nowhere. It was one man's interpretation of what a reserve is for, and reasonable people, including the regulators, didn't adopt it. So step back with me for a second, because we've now covered the hardest financial facts. And I want you to notice what actually happened. Almost every fact survived. The reserve is real. The concealment was real. The whistleblower was real. What changed every single time was the sentence built on top of the fact. And that's the thing I most want you to take from this channel. You can lose an argument on the framing and still get every number right. Which brings me to the claim sitting underneath all of it, the one Johnny keeps coming back to. His word for the whole system is control. He points out, correctly, that tithing is 10% of a member's income, and that you can't enter the temple, can't attend your own child's temple wedding without a temple recommend, the interview and card that confirm you're, among other things, a full tithe payer. And then he lands the line. He asks what the members think about their tithing being used to run a hedge fund. It's a sharp line. It's built on true facts. And this is exactly where our own side tends to lose its footing. So let me not lose mine. Here's the steelman. If you're standing outside the faith, this really can look like a toll booth in front of heaven. Pay the 10%, or you're locked out of the holiest thing your family will ever do. I understand why that reads as coercion. I'm not going to pretend I don't. But watch what the word coercion quietly imports, and then watch what the facts actually are. Tithing runs entirely on the honor system. Nobody audits your income. Nobody checks a pay stub. You sit across from a local leader who is an unpaid volunteer, and you declare it yourself. Johnny, by the way, confirms that piece, too. He says right out loud that the missionaries and most of the people who run the church are unpaid, that they have normal jobs and pay their own way. So the picture of a slick financial machine squeezing its members doesn't survive contact with the actual room, which is two ordinary people and a question you answer on your honor. And the practice isn't some modern fundraising trick bolted on by investment managers in the 1970s. It's in the book of Malachi. It's older than every stock in that portfolio by thousands of years. Members don't experience it as a fee. They experience it as the widow's mite, a costly thing offered on purpose, and the cost is the whole point. You can decide that's unwise. What you can't honestly do is call a gift you calculate and hand over yourself an extraction. And now I owe you the turn I promised, the one pointed at my own people. Because the reason a video like this travels so far isn't only that Johnny is talented, though he is. It's that too often, when we get questioned, we answer the accusation instead of the person. We reach for the rebuttal before we've granted the fair part. So let me model the other way, one last time, on the hardest ground there is. The origin story itself. In his history film, Johnny tells the story of Joseph Smith, the young treasure hunter, the boy who used a seer stone, a smooth stone he believed he could receive revelation through, to look for buried gold. And then, Johnny says, that same man used that same stone, dropped into a hat, his face buried in the hat, to dictate the Book of Mormon. At one point he says of Joseph, "Clearly, this guy is making it up." Now there's a long list of things a defender is tempted to deny right here. I'm not going to deny them, because here's what a fair member has to admit. On the mechanics, Johnny is right, and he's more honest than the Sunday school version I grew up on. Joseph did dig for treasure as a young man. The translation did involve a stone in a hat. The plural marriages did include a teenager and women already married to other men. Johnny leans on a believing Latter-day Saint historian, Richard Bushman, rather than only hostile sources. And he calls the Book of Mormon a genuinely compelling piece of work. That isn't a hit piece. That's a careful man. So what's left to correct? Only this, and it's everything. The frame that these facts are the church's embarrassing secret is about a decade out of date. Every one of them is now published by the church itself. The stone in the hat is described in plain language in the church's own Gospel Topics essay titled Book of Mormon Translation. Joseph's youthful money digging is in the church's official history, the one called Saints, and in the Joseph Smith papers, the church's own archive. The several different accounts of his first vision are laid out in another essay the church put on its own website. The secret Johnny thinks he's revealing is a secret the church already told. And where he slides from the fact to the verdict, where he says clearly he's making it up, notice that this isn't history anymore. It's a conclusion of faith, his faith, that these things have a natural explanation. He's allowed to hold it. He even admits at the end of his film that he can't fully resolve it, that he feels a paradox with no clean answer. I respect that more than I can say. I just want to be honest about where the evidence stops and belief begins, on both sides. Sincerity and invention can leave behind the very same paper trail. The documents don't settle it. They never have. And an honest historian, believer or skeptic, says exactly that. Instead of pretending the record decides a thing the record can't reach. He makes one more claim in that history film that deserves a straight answer, because dodging it would be its own kind of dishonesty. He says there's no archaeological, genetic, or linguistic evidence that a group of Israelites crossed to the Americas around 600 years before Christ. On the mainstream science, he's stating the consensus fairly, and I'm not going to wave some magic artifact at you and pretend otherwise. Latter-day Saint scholars themselves argue over how to read the text, whether its events belong to a smaller region rather than two whole continents, and how ancient migration and modern genetics fit together. Where those scholars disagree, I'm going to leave them disagreeing, because that's the honest state of the question. What I'll say is narrower. The absence of the evidence you went looking for isn't the same thing as evidence that the event never happened. And a book that a skeptical, secular filmmaker calls compelling isn't explained away by pointing at what archaeology hasn't dug up yet. That's the seam where history quietly hands the question over to faith, for him and for me both. So here's my honest takeaway on Johnny Harris. He's not a liar, and he's not our enemy. He's a thoughtful former member who did more real homework than almost anyone who talks about us, got most of his facts right, and then framed them the way a person frames the faith he walked away from. The facts, I'll grant him nearly all day long. The framing is where I'd gently ask you to look twice. A reserve isn't a hoard. A disclosure failure isn't tax fraud. A gift you calculate yourself isn't a toll. And a secret the church has already published isn't a secret at all. If we can hold those distinctions calmly, without heat, we don't need to fear a single well-made video. We can just tell the truer version and trust you to weigh it. And that's exactly what I want to ask you to do. Down in the comments, tell me this. What is the one thing outsiders get wrong about your faith that you wish they understood? Not the thing that makes you angry, the thing you wish you could explain over coffee, or over something that isn't coffee. If you know, you know. I read them, and the best ones shape where this channel goes next. I'm Nathan Reeves. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.